Hi students, Professor Matt here. Today's lecture is on structuralism and semiotic analysis. Now, structuralism is a literary theory that came from France to the United States in the early 1960s. Now, it had a fairly short-lived career until Jacques Derrida came on the scene in 1966 and sort of put a kibosh on structuralism to some extent. Now, it did, however, inspire trends in other literary theories, anything from Marxism to psychoanalysis, feminism, race, ethnicity, as well as another branch of structuralism called semiotic analysis. So its legacy certainly lives on, and some of its key insights are still very important. Now, the movement of structuralism was one in which the structuralist movement attempted to understand language through scientific study. So its end goal was ultimately to try to account for all of human thought and behavior and speech and action. And of course it wasn't successful on this level, but it was, however, essential in uncovering some important truths about the way in which we communicate. And one thing that structuralists tried to do was uncover what they called these deep structures of language. One goal of structuralism was to take an object, to decompose it, and then attempt to recompose it. So if we compare this to the formalist approach to a text, formalism looks at how particular parts or literary devices can be broken down and looked at as discrete units and then put back together to create a whole. And of course the whole in this sense that we're talking about is, say, a particular novel. So we're looking at how literary devices work within a specific novel. Structuralism, on the other hand, would take particular novels, so a series of novels, and through analysis try to theorize about some object called the novel, which would be a new virtual object. And so in this case, this new virtual object novel is not any particular actual physical novel, but rather a theory that attempts to say what it is that the deep structures are that create a novel. And of course, that's the end goal of structuralism, is to arrange something called this deep structure which accounts for all the particulars, all the specific instances. Now, Ferdinand de Saussure was a key figure of structuralism. And Saussure talked about the sign, the signified, and the signifier. And he broke down communication into these three things. Now, the sign is a combination of the signified and the signifier. The signifier is a word. And of course we know that words are arbitrary because there's a variety of different languages, right? So we have the word for tree in the English language, and the Spanish language has a different word, the French language, and so on and so forth. And so we know because of this that words are arbitrary. Now that's the signifier, the word. On the other hand, we have the signified, and that's the concept that a word brings to mind. And of course, if I say the word tree, everyone is going to have a different conception of tree. Some of you might be thinking of deciduous trees, others of evergreen trees. Some may be thinking of maple trees or oak trees. Some of you may have fond memories of trees, about the fort that you built when you were a kid and you loved playing in trees, and others of you might have more traumatic experiences. Maybe you remember the time you were climbing a tree and the branch broke and you fell and broke your leg. So the signified is what it brings to mind in an individual when they hear a signifier or a word. And then the sign is the combination of those two things. It's a combination of the word as well as the image that comes to mind when that word is spoken. And signs are the basic building blocks of language. It's how we create meaning out of the world, essentially. And so the structuralists try to analyze the rules according to which these signs are arranged and how society tries to organize itself around various signs. And one key insight that Saussure had is that meaning is created through binary oppositions. And this is going to be one key principle that we should be able to apply fairly easily to text that we're reading, is creating sort of binary oppositions that will help us create meaning from those texts. Saussure said that language is not a function of the speaker, but rather it's a product that's passively assimilated by the individual. In this sense, language isn't something that's private, but it's available in the public domain. And language also includes everything, not only in the dictionary, but everything that could be codified as a system of rules, so grammar, syntax, idiom, etc. And language is something that exists only in theory. Now, by contrast, speech is what we actually do. And in order for us to make sense out of speech, we must reference language. We must reference that theory, that public domain. And of course, we understand signs differentially. And that's to say through a process of negation. So we know that something is hot because it's not cold. We know that something's wet because it's not dry. And so that's the sense of the binary, the hot, cold, the wet, dry, the good and evil, and also the process of differentiation. We know one thing exists as such because it is not something else. And so these two insights are really key for us to understand how we as humans make sense of the world and how we create meaning. And of course, within this system of signs, context is always key. Simply think of homonyms, words that sound the same but have different meanings. Which and which, right? You only know if I'm talking about, whether to decide between one thing or another, or if I'm talking about sort of creature with a long pointy nose, warts, and flies around on a broom. Which or which? By the context, because those words sound the exact same. And there's scores of homonyms, hundreds of homonyms in our language. And another key feature of structuralism, according to Saussure, is that language doesn't exist in isolation, but rather it exists within the system. And so the theorists talk about the Big Bang of language, which is to say that language has to be created in an instant. Sort of the rules of language have to be created all at one time. It's not this sort of gradual accrual of rules and syntax and so forth, but the system has to sort of come into being instantaneously, much in the way that astrophysicists talk about the universe coming into being in this instant, in this Big Bang. Now, semiotics is not, strictly speaking, a literary theory per se, but rather we can think about literature as a subfield of semiotics. And semiotics is essentially the study of existing conventions and communication systems. So it helps explain how any field of interrelated objects becomes intelligible as that particular field. So you could have Darwinian semiotics, you can have literary semiotics, and so on and so forth. Now let's think of a specific example. If I say a box of chocolates given on Valentine's Day, right? If we think about this according to its intrinsic value versus its social value. Now, chocolates might not have as much nutritional value as I would like them to have, but there might be some intrinsic value involved with eating chocolates. But of course, if I give chocolates to my wife on Valentine's Day, that becomes symbolic of my love for her. And of course, there's nothing intrinsic within chocolate that makes you think of love, but it's only this socially accepted thing. So we sort of foist our value onto that inanimate object. And these are the sorts of things that a semiotician would analyze. Also think of the sign pickup truck or minivan, right? These are two very different sorts of signs, and they should conjure very different images in your mind when you think about them. Of course, they're both used for transportation, they're both used for hauling things. But whether you're a rugged individualist or a soccer mom, you might be drawn to one or the other. All right, some key principles of structuralist analysis. 1, the language structures our perception of the world. And you might be familiar with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. That's the idea that there is no objective reality that we can know apart from the language that we use to make sense of it. And so in this sense, it says that our basic cognitive structures are in place, and they're dependent upon language to imbibe them with some sort of meaning. And so the only way that we can make sense out of the world is through the language that we use to try to do so. Now, this idea is in opposition to a more traditional assumption that language exists simply as a descriptive code. And we use that code to understand reality, and it's communicated to us in a very transparent method. Now, the structuralists would say there's absolutely nothing simple or transparent about language, but language is full of political beliefs, it's full of social values, it's full of judgments, it's full of ideologies, and these things are ultimately what help inform our worldview, how we view the world. And although most of us think we control language, a good structuralist would say that language actually controls us. The second key principle is that language is understandable as a system of signs, and so meaning is created through the relationships between those signs. Again, that's the big bang of language. There has to be this system that's in place in order for any of it to make sense. We can't understand just one little part of the universe of language. We have to have an understanding of these deep structures of the whole system. And through the process of signification, values are imposed on otherwise value-free entities. So the box of chocolates, the pickup truck, the minivan, right, get all these sort of social values attached to them. The third and fourth key principles are that signs can be understandable either synchronically or diachronically. And synchronically means simply that we can understand a sign at a particular one moment in time without thinking about it historically, whereas diachronic analysis looks at the chronology of a sign, how it's evolved and changed throughout history. Now, if we think about this as applied to literary text, Mark Twain's novel Huckleberry Finn might be an interesting example for a diachronic analysis. At one point in time, the novel was banned because culture felt it was too sympathetic in depicting a relationship between a white boy and a black man, and so it was deemed too progressive. At another point in time, it was banned because the novel was seen as being too racist. And so here you have the same novel, the same words, the same signifiers there, but they create in culture very different ideas about how we should socially accept these relationships in the novel. Of course, you could do that with anything. You can look at the history of a pickup truck, or the history of a minivan, or the history of how chocolate begins to be associated with romance. So you could look at it historically, you could also just look at it at one particular moment in time. The fifth key principle is that literature is a manifestation of sign systems. And so stories ultimately help structure culture. They give us ways of talking and narrating the world and helping us understand the reality in which we exist. You can study a text synchronically or diachronically, as we've mentioned. You can look for deep structures in a text or in a series of texts. Binary oppositions is going to be another key, and I think this is perhaps one of the most useful applications of structuralism, is that you can look for binary oppositions in text. So how does a text set up a binary? That might be light and dark, wet and dry, hot and cold, good and evil, are very simple binaries. There might be more complex binaries that are operating in a text. And then a structuralist might also ask, how does a culture decide what texts are worthy of analysis and what texts are not? The sixth key principle is that no sign is fully understandable. And so as opposed to, say, new criticism, which held on to a belief that there was sort of one ascertainable meaning to a text, we have what I call a humble hermeneutics here, is the understanding that texts are very complicated, signs and the system of signs is very complicated, the way in which they're interwoven one with another, that really the goal of a good structuralist would be to try to capture part of a sign's meaning. So we're not trying to have the definitive reading or the absolute reading or the one and only reading of a text, but we're just trying to provide some insight. We have rather a humble hermeneutics. And so this concludes our brief introduction to structuralism and semiotic analysis.